In 264 BCE, Rome had no navy. Not a small navy, not an outdated navy. No navy at all. The Romans were farmers and soldiers, people of the land who had spent centuries conquering the Italian peninsula, one legion at a time. They knew nothing about building ships, navigating the sea, or fighting on water. Their enemies, the Carthaginians, had been master sailors for generations, descendants of the Phoenicians who had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, and yet, within a few short years, Rome would build a fleet from scratch, copy their enemies' technology, invent new weapons of their own, and defeat the greatest naval power in the ancient world. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to discover one of the most audacious military transformations in history, how a landlocked city of farmers became masters of the sea, and what that tells us about the Roman will to win. The story begins with a fundamental mismatch. On one side stood Rome, a city-state in central Italy that had spent the previous century conquering its neighbours. The Romans had built the most disciplined and effective infantry force in the ancient world, the legions that would eventually conquer an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. But they were a land power. Their experience was in sieges and pitched battles, in marching armies across the Italian countryside and grinding down enemy resistance through sheer determination. The sea was a foreign element, something they crossed only when absolutely necessary, usually on ships borrowed from their Greek allies in southern Italy. On the other side stood Carthage, a city that had been founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre centuries earlier. The Carthaginians had salt water in their blood. Their ancestors had been sailing the Mediterranean since before Rome existed. They had established trading posts across the Western Sea, from North Africa to Spain to Sardinia to Sicily. Their navy was the finest in the world, sleek warships crewed by experienced sailors who had learned their craft from childhood. When Carthaginian fleets put to sea, other powers paid attention. The First Punic War broke out in 264 BCE over control of Sicily, the largest and richest island in the Mediterranean. It began almost by accident, with Rome intervening to support a band of Italian mercenaries who had seized the city of Messana. But once begun, the war quickly escalated into an existential struggle between two powers that could not coexist. Rome's legions performed well on land, as they always did. They defeated Carthaginian and Syracusan forces in a series of battles and established themselves as the dominant military presence on Sicily. But they could not finish the job. Carthage still controlled the seas around Sicily, which meant they could resupply their garrisons, land troops wherever they chose, and raid the Italian coast with impunity. As long as Carthage ruled the waves, Rome could win every battle on land and still lose the war. The Roman Senate faced an uncomfortable truth. They needed a navy. Not just a few ships, but a full battle fleet capable of challenging Carthaginian supremacy. It was a daunting prospect. Building warships required specialized knowledge that Romans did not possess. Knowledge of ship design, of timber selection, of the complex engineering that allowed a vessel to survive combat at sea. Crewing those ships required thousands of trained rowers who could coordinate their movements with the precision of a military formation. Rome had none of this. What Rome did have was determination, organizational ability, and a complete unwillingness to accept defeat. If they could not beat Carthage at sea, they would learn to beat Carthage at sea, and they would learn fast. According to our primary source, the Greek historian Polybius, the Romans received an extraordinary piece of luck. A Carthaginian warship, a quinquereme, the standard heavy warship of the era, ran aground on the Italian coast and was captured intact. The Romans now possessed a working example of their enemy's most formidable weapon. Instead of trying to design their own ships from scratch, they could simply copy what Carthage had already perfected. A quinquereme was a marvel of ancient engineering. The name comes from the Latin quinque, 5, and remus, oar, referring to the arrangement of rowers, though exactly how those rowers were arranged remains debated by scholars. The most likely configuration involved 3 banks of oars, with 5 men working together on each vertical section, 2 men on the top oar, 2 on the middle oar, and 1 on the bottom. Each ship required approximately 300 rowers, plus a complement of sailors to handle the rigging and roughly 120 marines for combat. The quinquereme was built for one purpose: ramming. Ancient naval warfare was not about cannon fire or long-range missiles. Those technologies would not exist for another millennium. It was about driving your ship's bronze ram into the side of an enemy vessel, punching a hole below the waterline, and letting the sea do the killing. This required precise manoeuvring, coordinated rowing, and crews who could execute complex turns and attacks at full speed. It required, in short, exactly the kind of expertise that the Carthaginians possessed and the Romans lacked. Undeterred, the Roman Senate authorized an ambitious construction program. They would build 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes, a fleet of 120 warships, in approximately 60 days. It sounds impossible, and many modern historians have expressed skepticism about the timeline. But even if we allow for some exaggeration by ancient sources, the scale of the Roman effort was extraordinary. The logistics alone were staggering. Each quinquereme required enormous quantities of timber, oak and pine, carefully selected for different parts of the ship. The keel, the spine of the vessel, needed to be strong enough to support the entire structure and absorb the shock of ramming. The planking had to be watertight. The oars, which might be 30 feet long or more, needed to be balanced precisely so that rowers could maintain a steady rhythm for hours at a time. Rome mobilized its resources with the same efficiency it brought to military campaigns. Timber was harvested from Italian forests. Craftsmen were recruited from Greek cities in southern Italy, places like Tarentum and Naples that had genuine naval traditions. Workers were organized into teams, with each team responsible for a specific part of the construction process. The ships were built using assembly line techniques that would not be seen again on this scale until the Industrial Age. While the ships were being built, the Romans faced another problem. Who would row them? 300 rowers per quinquereme meant 30,000 men just to crew the battle fleet, men who needed to know how to handle an oar, how to keep time with their fellows, how to respond instantly to commands they might not hear over the chaos of battle. Here Polybius tells us something remarkable. The Romans built wooden frameworks on shore, arranged exactly like the rowing benches of a quinquereme, and trained their rowers on dry land. Thousands of men sat on these wooden structures, practicing the synchronized motions of rowing, while the ships themselves were still under construction. When the vessels were finally completed and launched, the rowers already knew their positions and had developed the muscle memory needed to pull together. This was Roman pragmatism at its finest. They could not give their rowers years of experience at sea. There was no time for that. But they could teach them the mechanics of rowing, drill them until the motions became automatic, and hope that would be enough. It was a calculated gamble, but the Romans were playing to their strengths. What they lacked in finesse, they would make up in discipline and organization. The fleet was completed, more or less on schedule, if we believe the sources, and the Romans now possessed a naval force on paper comparable to Carthage's. But possessing ships and knowing how to use them were different matters. The Carthaginians had been fighting naval battles for centuries. They knew how to maneuver in combat, how to position for a ramming attack, how to back off and attack again. Their crews were veterans who could execute complex maneuvers at full speed without confusion. The Romans were beginners. Rather than try to match Carthaginian seamanship, the Romans invented a way around it. They would change the rules of naval warfare to favor their own strengths. The device they created was called the corvus, Latin for raven or crow. It was a boarding bridge, approximately 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, mounted on a rotating base near the bow of each Roman ship. The bridge could swing in any direction and was equipped at its end with a heavy iron spike shaped like a bird's beak, hence the name. When a Roman ship came alongside an enemy vessel, the corvus would drop. The spike would punch through the enemy's deck and lock the two ships together, and Roman marines would charge across the bridge to fight hand to hand. The genius of the corvus was that it transformed naval battles into infantry fights. Roman soldiers were the best in the world at close-quarters combat. It was what they trained for, what they had done for generations. By locking ships together and boarding, the Romans could negate Carthaginian advantages in seamanship and turn every engagement into the kind of fight they knew how to win. The corvus had disadvantages. It was heavy, perhaps weighing a ton or more, and mounting it near the bow made ships top-heavy and difficult to handle, especially in rough seas. Ships equipped with the corvus were slower and less manoeuvrable than their Carthaginian opponents. But the Romans calculated that the advantages outweighed the risks. They were not trying to outsail the Carthaginians. They were trying to get close enough to board. In 260 BCE, the new Roman fleet put to sea under the command of the consul Gaius Duilius. The Carthaginians, confident in their naval superiority, sailed to meet them near the town of Mylae on the northern coast of Sicily. They expected an easy victory. These Romans were landlubbers who had only been sailing for a few months. How could they possibly challenge masters of the sea? The battle that followed shocked the Mediterranean world. The Carthaginians approached in their usual fashion, planning to use their superior manoeuvring ability to ram and sink the clumsy Roman vessels. But when they came alongside, the corvus dropped. Roman marines poured across the boarding bridges and overwhelmed the Carthaginian crews in hand-to-hand combat. The Carthaginian admiral's flagship was captured. By the end of the battle, the Romans had taken or sunk around 50 Carthaginian ships. Mylae was a stunning victory and Rome celebrated accordingly. Duilius was awarded a triumph, the highest honour a Roman commander could receive, and a column decorated with the prows of captured ships was erected in the Roman Forum. For the first time in their history, the Romans had defeated a major power at sea, but Mylae was only the beginning. The war would continue for another 2 decades, and the Romans would learn that naval warfare involved challenges beyond winning battles. Encouraged by their success at Mylae, the Romans expanded their naval operations. They built more ships, trained more crews, and prepared to take the war to Africa itself, to strike at Carthage's homeland as the Carthaginians had struck at Sicily. In 256 BCE, a massive Roman fleet sailed south to invade Africa. On the way, they encountered a Carthaginian fleet near Cape Ecnomus, off the southern coast of Sicily. What followed was one of the largest naval battles in ancient history, perhaps the largest ever fought, with some ancient sources claiming that more than 300 ships and 300,000 men were involved. These numbers are probably exaggerated, but even conservative estimates suggest a battle of staggering scale. The Romans won again, using the corvus to grapple Carthaginian ships and board them. The Carthaginian fleet was scattered, and the way to Africa lay open. A Roman expeditionary force landed near Carthage under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, ravaging the countryside and terrifying the Carthaginian population. For a moment it seemed that Rome might win the war quickly. Carthage sued for peace, but Regulus, overconfident in his success, demanded terms so harsh that the Carthaginians chose to keep fighting. They hired a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus to reorganize their army, and at the Battle of Tunis in 255 BCE, Xanthippus destroyed Regulus's force. The consul himself was captured, and only a few thousand Romans escaped back to their ships. The African expedition had ended in disaster, but worse was to come. The Roman fleet that rescued the survivors set sail for home in the summer of 255 BCE. They were sailing through waters they barely knew, on ships they had only recently learned to build, with crews who had limited experience in seamanship. When a storm caught them off the southern coast of Sicily, the result was catastrophic. Ancient sources claim that the Romans lost 284 ships and perhaps 100,000 men in a single storm, drowned, smashed against rocks, vanished into the sea. Even if these numbers are exaggerated, the disaster was of a scale that would have ended the naval ambitions of almost any other state. In a single day, the Romans lost more men than the Carthaginians had killed in years of fighting. Rome rebuilt. Within a year, they had constructed a new fleet and were back at sea. And then, in 253 BCE, another storm destroyed another fleet. 150 ships lost, tens of thousands more dead. The Senate, reeling from the losses, temporarily suspended naval operations. But they did not give up. They could not give up. The war in Sicily ground on, and as long as Carthage controlled the sea, final victory was impossible. The Romans returned to the sea again and again, learning from their mistakes, adjusting their tactics, paying the price in ships and lives. They learned to avoid sailing during storm season. They improved their ship designs, eventually abandoning the top-heavy corvus in favour of more seaworthy vessels. They developed better admirals and more experienced crews. The cost was staggering. Modern historians estimate that Rome lost somewhere between 600 and 700 ships during the First Punic War, many of them to storms rather than enemy action. The human toll was in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps 300,000 Romans and Italians dead, most of them drowned rather than killed in battle. It was a butcher's bill that would have broken almost any other civilization. But Rome was not like other civilizations. The Romans had a saying, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. Though that phrase became famous later, the sentiment was there from the beginning. The Romans simply refused to accept that they could not master the sea. They would learn, they would adapt, they would absorb losses that would have shattered lesser powers, and they would eventually prevail. In 241 BCE, after 23 years of war, the Romans finally delivered the knockout blow. They had built one last fleet, 200 ships, crewed by experienced sailors who had learned their trade through hard years of warfare. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands, off the western coast of Sicily, this fleet intercepted a Carthaginian convoy, carrying supplies to their besieged garrison. The battle was decisive. The Roman fleet, no longer the clumsy newcomers of 20 years before, outmaneuvered and destroyed the Carthaginian force. 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk, 70 more were captured. Carthage's ability to supply Sicily was gone, and with it any hope of continuing the war. Carthage sued for peace, and this time Rome's terms were accepted. Carthage surrendered Sicily, paid a massive indemnity, and agreed not to attack Rome's allies. The First Punic War was over, and Rome had won. What does this story tell us about the Romans and about military adaptation more broadly? First, it tells us that the Romans were not too proud to copy their enemies. Many cultures would have considered it shameful to admit that an opponent had better technology, better to struggle with inferior equipment than to acknowledge foreign superiority. The Romans felt no such embarrassment. When they captured that Carthaginian quinquereme, they did not destroy it in a fit of pride. They studied it, copied it, and used their copy to defeat its creators. This willingness to borrow was a consistent Roman trait. Throughout their history, the Romans adopted weapons, tactics, and even gods from the peoples they conquered. The gladius, the famous Roman short sword, was copied from Spanish designs. The Roman mail shirt came from the Gauls. Even Roman religion incorporated deities from Greece, Egypt, and the East. The Romans understood that good ideas could come from anywhere, and they were practical enough to use them. Second, the story shows the Roman genius for organization. Building a fleet of 120 warships in 60 days, even if the timeline is somewhat exaggerated, required coordination on a massive scale. Timber had to be harvested, transported, and prepared. Craftsmen had to be recruited and organized. Work crews had to operate in parallel, with each team completing its tasks in sequence with the others. Training thousands of rowers while the ships were still being built required planning that most ancient societies could not have imagined. This organizational ability was not accidental. Rome had developed it over centuries of military campaigning, learning how to mobilize resources, manage logistics, and coordinate complex operations. The same skills that allowed them to raise legions, supply armies in the field, and administer conquered territories could be applied to shipbuilding. The Romans did not need to invent new methods of organization. They applied methods they already knew to a new problem. Third, the story demonstrates Roman resilience in the face of catastrophic failure. The storm of 255 BCE killed as many Romans as some of history's greatest battles. A modern nation that lost 100,000 soldiers in a single disaster might well sue for peace. The Romans rebuilt their fleet and kept fighting. When another storm destroyed that fleet, they rebuilt again. Loss after loss, disaster after disaster, and still they came back. This resilience was partly cultural. The Romans had a self-image as a people who never surrendered, and partly structural. Rome could absorb losses that would have destroyed smaller states because Rome controlled the resources of most of Italy. They could draft new rowers from their Italian allies, harvest timber from Italian forests, and raise money through taxes and borrowing. Carthage, for all its wealth, did not have comparable manpower reserves. The Romans could afford to lose fleets that Carthage could not afford to lose. Fourth, the story shows the importance of tactical innovation. The corvus was a clever solution to a difficult problem. How could inexperienced Roman crews defeat skilled Carthaginian sailors? By changing the nature of the fight, by turning naval battles into boarding actions, the Romans negated their opponent's advantages and played to their own strengths. It was not elegant, and it had serious drawbacks, but it worked. The corvus also illustrates a principle that appears throughout military history. Weapons are adapted to circumstances. The Romans did not invent the idea of boarding enemy ships. Mediterranean pirates had been doing it for centuries. What they did was systematize the practice, designing a specific device that made boarding reliable rather than opportunistic. They took an existing concept and optimized it for their particular needs. Finally, the story reminds us that victory often goes not to the most skilled, but to the most persistent. The Carthaginians were better sailors than the Romans at the beginning of the First Punic War, and they were probably still better sailors at the end. But the Romans won anyway, because they kept coming back, kept learning, kept adapting, and kept fighting until the Carthaginians had nothing left. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Rome's naval transformation. Talent matters, but determination matters more. The Carthaginians had centuries of maritime expertise, but they faced an enemy who simply would not accept defeat. Every time the Romans suffered a setback, they analysed what went wrong, made adjustments, and tried again. That relentless process of trial and error, paid for in blood and treasure, eventually produced a navy that could challenge Carthage's finest. The Romans who fought at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE were not the same landlubbers who had launched their first fleet 2 decades earlier. They had earned their skills the hard way, through battle and disaster and endless practice. They had transformed themselves from farmers and soldiers into sailors and admirals. They had done what everyone said was impossible, and they had done it through sheer force of will. That transformation would have consequences far beyond the First Punic War. The navy that Rome built to defeat Carthage would go on to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. Roman fleets would suppress piracy, transport legions to distant battlefields, and maintain the trade routes that connected the empire. The Mare Nostrum, our sea, is what the Romans would eventually call the Mediterranean, and they had earned the right to call it that. The Carthaginians, for their part, never recovered their naval supremacy. They would fight 2 more wars against Rome, the Second Punic War, with Hannibal's legendary invasion of Italy, and the Third Punic War, which ended with Carthage's complete destruction. But in neither would they dominate the sea as they had before. The student had surpassed the teacher, and the pupil would go on to rule the ancient world. What about the captured quinquereme that started it all? We do not know what happened to that specific ship. Perhaps it was incorporated into the Roman fleet, serving alongside the vessels it had inspired. Perhaps it was broken up for study, its timbers examined and its design memorized before the wood was discarded. Perhaps it rotted on some Italian beach, forgotten once it had served its purpose. But its legacy was immense. That single ship, captured by chance or skill, gave the Romans the blueprint they needed to challenge Carthaginian supremacy. Without it, or something like it, Rome's path to naval power would have been much harder. The capture was lucky, but luck favours those who are prepared to use it. The Romans were prepared. The story of Rome's naval transformation is often overshadowed by more dramatic tales from the Punic Wars. Hannibal's elephants crossing the Alps, the slaughter at Cannae, the final destruction of Carthage. But in many ways the naval story is more instructive. It shows us how a great power is made, not through any single brilliant victory, but through the accumulation of small decisions, persistent effort, and the refusal to accept that anything is impossible. The Romans who voted to build that first fleet in 260 BCE could not have known what they were starting. They were responding to an immediate military necessity, not planning centuries of Mediterranean dominance. But the habits of mind they brought to the problem, the willingness to learn from enemies, the organizational discipline, the acceptance of losses as the price of eventual victory, would serve Rome well for generations to come. So the next time you face a challenge that seems impossible, remember those Roman farmers looking at a captured Carthaginian warship on an Italian beach. They knew nothing about ships, nothing about sailing, nothing about naval warfare, but they were willing to learn, willing to copy, willing to fail, and willing to try again. Within 2 decades, they had defeated the greatest naval power in the ancient world and set themselves on the path to empire. That is the Roman way. Not genius, but persistence. Not inspiration, but organization. Not pride, but pragmatism. They copied a ship, trained rowers on dry land, invented a clumsy boarding bridge, lost fleet after fleet to storms, and kept coming back until they won. It was not elegant, but it was effective, and in the end that was all that mattered. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, and the farmers became masters of the sea, all because they looked at an enemy ship and thought, we can do that too. And they were right.